Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Nisha Bochwe, Dean of the Humphrey School, and I want to thank you all for joining us for our second panel in this important series, exploring the executive actions and policy implications of a second Trump administration. I'm delighted to see all of you here with us today. I see a number of students and some faculty and staff with us. We are going to have an engaged and thoughtful dialogue about the challenges and opportunities we face in this evolving political landscape. Last week, in our first panel, we focused on immigration policy, national security, and gender and human rights, critical areas where executive actions have profound domestic and global consequences. The conversation underscored the complexities of navigating policy shifts that affect millions of lives, both here in the U.S. and around the world. Tonight, we turn our attention to government restructuring, democratic processes, and foreign policy implications. We'll explore potential actions such as downsizing federal departments, reconfiguring civil service protections, and renegotiating international alliances, and what these mean for the future of governance, economic stability, and global cooperation. Our distinguished panelists, Professor Michael Minta, Professor Larry Jacobs, and diplomat in residence, or maybe I should say former diplomat in residence, Mary Curtin, bring a wealth of expertise and perspectives to these really pressing issues. Their insights will not only help us understand the policy directions we might anticipate, but also challenge us to think critically about how to navigate these challenges for the common good. As we continue this series, I hope you take away not just knowledge, but also a renewed commitment to fostering informed, respectful dialogue, the cornerstone of the Humphrey School's mission. Thank you again for being a part of this essential conversation. And now I turn it over to our moderator, Associate Dean Ryan Allen, to guide us through tonight's discussion.
Thank you so much, Nisha. And again, welcome everybody. I am going to, okay, so I'm going to stick to the prepared remarks because it turns out they're being broadcast on the screen. Thank you for joining us for the second panel in our series on executive actions and policy implications in the second Trump administration. Again, my name is Ryan Allen. I had the pleasure of serving as the Associate Dean for Research here at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. My own research explores topics like immigration, refugee policy, urban planning, and housing, so this is a critically important kind of discussion that I'm glad to be a part of. Before we begin, I want to express my gratitude to our panelists who are seated to my left, and to all of you for engaging in this important conversation. This series has been designed to foster thoughtful, evidence-based dialogue about the policy shifts we may see in the coming years and their broader implications. As many of you experienced last week when we had our first panel, we explored topics such as immigration, gender policies, and human rights. Tonight, we'll delve into government restructuring, democratic processes, and foreign policy implications, critical areas that will shape the domestic and international landscape. Throughout the panel, we encourage you to your engagement using Slido. Simply scan the QR code displayed on the screen to submit your questions, and that QR code has just come on, I think. During the moderated and audience Q&A sessions, I'll incorporate your questions into the discussion. Now, let me introduce our panelists this evening. Dr. Mary Curtin on the far left. Mary is the interim program director at Global Minnesota and has a 25-year career as a Department of State Foreign Service officer. She has served in various roles, including political counselor in Warsaw, Poland, and as part of the U.S. delegation to the 1995 UN Conference on Women. With a PhD in history from Columbia University, her expertise spans U.S.-EU relations and global democratic governance. Welcome, Mary. Next to Mary is Dr. Michael Minta. Michael is a professor of political science and director of graduate studies at the University of Minnesota here at the university. As a recovering director of graduate studies myself, God bless you, Michael. A leading authority on the political representation of African American and Latino interests. His recent book, No Longer Outsiders, won the 2023 W.E.B. Du Bois Distinguished Book Award. Michael's extensive work on Congress and minority representation provides critical insights into U.S. democratic processes and governance. And finally, to my immediate left, Dr. Larry Jacobs. Larry is the director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance and holds the Walter F. and Joan Mondale Chair for Political Studies. With a career dedicated to analyzing American democracy, national elections, and economic inequality, Larry has authored 17 books, and based on a conversation we were just having, it sounds like there's at least one or two more coming out in the near future, including Democracy Under Fire, this one's out already, Donald Trump and the Breaking of American History. His contributions to political science have earned him a place as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The way we're going to proceed this evening is each panelist will have a time to offer unique perspectives on tonight's themes, drawing from their rich academic and professional experiences. We're going to start with their own remarks. Each of them will have an opportunity to speak. We're going to pivot then, after they're finished, with questions that are coming from me as the moderator, and then we will pivot for the last part of our time together with questions from the audience. So without further ado, Larry, let's start with you. I'd like you to respond to the prompt. How do you believe that the second Trump administration will shape policies, practices, and potentially outcomes related to your area of expertise?
Big impact, and I'm anticipating over time diminishing influence. And I'd like to talk about a cycle involving Donald Trump's impact on both policy but also the public agenda. I think everyone who has an interest in this area should strap in, because the opening months, beginning with Inauguration Day, is going to be shock and awe. Donald Trump has got extraordinary skills in setting an agenda, and we're going to see quite an agenda that will look like the end of American public life as we know it. And my kind of, suggestion to you is take it seriously, for sure. We're going to see executive orders issued to reduce funding for DEI in universities and other institutions. There's going to be a major assault on a whole host of issues related to that. We're going to see declarations of national emergency as a way to increase energy production, roll back climate change policies, use the military for mass deportations of undocumented immigrants, remove job protections for tens of thousands of federal workers. So this is what I mean, shock and awe. This is not by any means the full list. What I anticipate is that we're going to see, broad references to this in Donald Trump's language, and then a host of executive orders coming out during the first week. So it's going to be pretty comprehensive. It'll be about as comprehensive a set of policies being proposed by a president than we've seen, maybe since Ronald Reagan. But I also want to add that I think over the coming year and years, we're going to see a diminishing of Donald Trump's influence for a number of reasons. One is I anticipate that the opposition will slow down and obstruct his effort to try to set the agenda. I think we're going to see in Congress that his effort to move legislation in areas where he has to and can't rely on executive orders is going to be very difficult. He has the Republicans have a trifecta, but the majority in the House is the narrowest it's ever been, and it's going to be narrower because Donald Trump has selected two members of the Republican incoming majority for positions in his cabinet, and one has resigned, Matt Gaetz. So they're going to be down to two, which means just one defecting is going to create all sorts of trouble. If you remember back just a few months ago or a year ago, you'll remember all the trouble they had with a majority that was similarly small. Then you've got the politics of the 2026 election. So things are going to be complicated, slow, contested in the House. That's going to delay things. And by the time you roll around in about a year's time, members of Congress, particularly in the House, but also the Senate, are going to be thinking more and more about the 2026 election and the pattern of the in-party being punished. They will also be more fully appreciating that Donald Trump is a lame duck and won't be facing pressure. The Joe Manchin experience the Democrats had is now going to be experienced by Republicans because they will be filibustered in the Senate on many issues. That's also going to slow things down. So this is all, kind of politics. And to me, I look at it and I'm like, yeah, I've seen this, this movie before. And it's going to have, it's going to slow down, defeat, and sidetrack Donald Trump. Now, there's also the Supreme Court. There's a lot that, I wouldn't overstate things, but I would say Donald Trump's first term, he lost more cases than any other president. So while you remember, some of his big efforts, he also, took it on the chin. And the court recently has been striking down the power of executive branch agencies to take action. They're requiring Congress to provide specific authorization for action. And that's going to also clip the wings of Trump's executive branch officials. Do I have a few more minutes? Yep, okay. I want to talk about one other element, and this is going to be very important and will dominate, I think, a lot of the conversations around Donald Trump, which is he breaking American democracy by acting against the law or on his own? And he may, but it also needs to be said that we have had an imperial presidency that's been building and taking form for decades, and you can trace it back to 200 years ago. If you read the Constitution, Article 2, these phrases like executive power, commander-in-chief, we've had 200 years of presidents inflating the original intent of that language into an almost unlimited repertoire of power. We've now had the Supreme Court make what I think a lot of us see as a ill-advised, open-ended decision in the immunity case with regards to Donald Trump, and that is going to push this kind of movement towards further presidential power, possibly into overdrive. It's reducing whatever clarity we had regarding the constraints, and it may encourage Congress to remain disengaged. After all, if you think back to the January 6th committee work, why put in that time? Why invest that political capital if you have a strong sense that little will come of it? So overall, I think Donald Trump is looking at some real challenges. I think this area of kind of the imperial presidency is going to give him efforts and an out, but I think that will be contested, particularly when he tries to apply it in the domestic arena, whether it's with deportation of immigrants, the carving out of the federal workforce. I think here it's going to be rough going. In terms of international activities, I think Donald Trump will be able to do what he wants for the most part, because that is the history now that we've established, whether it was Barack Obama and Joe Biden or Ronald Reagan and the Bushes. That's what's happened. So this is a very serious situation. I had the great fortune to work with Walter Mondale for 16 years. And Walter Mondale and I taught a course just on these issues. And we'd get to the end of the term, and Walter Mondale would say, my great concern is that over the 200 years of our history, we have now put a loaded gun on the table for the president to pick up. Donald Trump is reaching for that gun.
Thank you, Larry. Michael, let's turn to your comments.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Can you hear me? Well, so yeah, Gosh, you said what to expect in the second Trump presidency, and then I said, well, just you see Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy. I mean, a lot more of those type of individuals probably having kind of like this. I'd like to say, usually when you have people with that type of influence, donors or mega donors, they're usually in the shadows, but it's very, it'll be very interesting. He's on the call with the president of Ukraine, Elon Musk, and Trump. Unbelievable. But yeah, I expect much of what we saw between 2016 and 2020. We'll see a lot more of that, and you'll see a more experienced Trump and his administration, and you can see it in terms of the number of appointments and the swiftness in which they're nominating people, the transition team, and they're likely to get many of their nominees through. The one thing that I want to say when we look at this issue is it's not just about Trump, right? It's a Republican strategy, and I mean Trump is one of the champions of this strategy. I mean we can go way back, but I'm thinking about Pat Buchanan and many of the anti-immigrant. You know, we're going to be taken over. I mean, that rhetoric was seen as, you know, really far to the right. But now it's become, you know, somewhat mainstream. I think there are many establishment Republicans that still back away from it, but it seems to, particularly in this cycle, it's become a winning strategy. And unless that strategy is defeated, you will continue to see more type of policies and actions by Republicans in the presidency and within the House and the Senate in order to continue to win elections. Because politicians, I mean, yes, they're concerned about public policy and making the world better, but for the most part, a political party, they're hired to win elections and strategists to win elections. And I see more of that coming. And the country, you know, you've heard things about demographics, is it destiny? And I don't think most strategists believe that it's necessarily destiny, but demographics are changing in this country, and there's no doubt about it. It's becoming a more black and brown country. And you can look at the census, and by the U.S. Census, by 2040 something, it's going to be a majority minority, where racial and ethnic minorities will be in the majority in this country. And those groups tend to vote for Democrats. Now, granted, I mean, we've heard a lot with the exit polling. I'd be careful with the exit polling right now, looking too much into it, because those may change where the Republicans, where Trump did break into some particularly Latino men. But still, you know, is Trump, are Republicans always going to run someone like Donald Trump, right? And when you look at most state, local, and national elections, these groups tend to lean toward Democrats. Now, the issue is, can Democrats get these voters out to vote? And so that's their challenge, to incorporate them within the system. So you see these type of attacks. I heard Trump recently, I mean, he said it before, that, you know, he's going to get rid of birthright citizenship. Like, why would he say something like that? It's enshrined in the United States Constitution, 14th Amendment. Trump knows he can't do it. I mean, in this polarized country, we can't even get regular laws passed, much less the constitutional amendment, but it fires up the base. It fires them up. Like, yeah, he's doing something. So he's saying that when he gets in, he's going to issue an executive order that's going to say that children of undocumented immigrants, don't issue them a Social Security number. I mean, these type of things, he's going to do it, and it's going to create and really kind of muck up the system. But to the supporters, it's going to say he's doing everything in his power to try to make sure that our country is safe from undocumented immigrants. And So I am curious to see, and we could talk about it in the discussion, will he actually issue this executive order? Will Congress try to pass laws? And members of Congress do this all the time. They'll try to introduce legislation, they'll take a vote on it, and they can say, hey, we tried to do it, even though they know well it's not going to pass. And then even if it did pass Congress, it'd never get past the Senate, right? It could never get past the filibuster. But let's just entertain that it did somehow got passed, and Trump was able to sign it. Then the Supreme Court, now this is an interesting exercise. Would they rule that that legislation is unconstitutional? They would have to, right? All the legal scholars and all that, they would have to, but I don't think it'll get that far, but I think this is what Trump is doing. I think there's some other things like with the mass deportations. I think that's going to be interesting too, because that's where the president does have more power. He can appoint people to the Department of Homeland Security, which our neighbor, former governor, I think she's still governor, Kristi Noem, she'll be heading that up. And remember, she sent National Guard members down south of the border to protect, soldiers. We need to protect our border from this invasion. And so these type of things, I imagine with her in charge, and then you got the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, I can imagine that there's going to be executive orders and implementations to go and try to really round up undocumented people. And I read a news story recently that they said that they were going to, what was it? Right now, the ICE, they usually say that places of worship, schools are usually off limits when you're trying to deport people. But Trump is considering issuing an executive order saying, no, those places aren't off limits now. So can you imagine the theater, or let's say the horror, right, for groups, for people coming into churches, coming into hospitals, rounding them up? I think that's going to happen. And so, so I think that Trump, the Republicans have really pushed this, and I think he's going to have to deliver on this. If he does nothing, even if it's symbolic, it's going to be meaningful, but if he does nothing, then it's going to be really difficult for Republicans in the 2026 midterms, where the party of the president usually loses seats anyway. So imagine if there's nothing done. I think it's going to be the party, there's a real chance that Republicans could lose the House. They're very narrow majority in the House. The Senate, I'm not so sure, but it's very, very possible if there's immense backlash to this. So the Trump presidency, I'm going to see, I think we're just going to see more in terms of, and I'm going to say this, identity politics. Most people don't think about it with Republicans, but yes, I think you're going to see more identity politics, given more reason to the base to get riled up, to stay excited, because Republicans, again, just like Democrats, they want to win elections. Congress is going to be very tricky. Mike Johnson's going to have a really tough time, right, trying to bring in Republicans, and because they're going to really need, what the federal government does most. There's a lot of discretionary stuff, but what the federal government does most of the time is just fund existing programs and agencies. And so Republicans benefit from many of these agencies, and so do Democrats. So, I think there is this need to try to push, for the base, but at the end of the day, you have to fund government. So I think you're going to see Republicans and Democrats in this kind of uneasy, they're going to do more reconciliations. There are going to be more of these omnibus bills in order to get things done, so because government can function. In the Senate, will the Republicans, I know Trump expressed in his first presidency that they wanted to get rid of the filibuster. I don't know if John Thune, who's going to be the new Senate Majority Leader, if he's willing to go that far. But I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to get rid of that filibuster. I don't think that, well, I don't, we're just talking here about predicting. I don't know what they're going to do. I don't think that it's going to go away, but I think there's going to be tremendous pressure from from Senate leaders and House leaders and establishment to get rid of the filibuster. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Okay, we're going to pivot and think about global implications. Mary Curtin, your comments, please.
Oops, thanks. The pivot, though, actually isn't like a complete change of subject, right? So yeah, I was just thinking while Michael and Larry were both talking, how many times we brought up the issue about migration and refugees. And we always think of that as a domestic policy, but that is it is by its nature international, right? Those are people where are you going to send them back to? France, in the past, put people on a plane and flew into Mali without even asking for landing rights. Is that what they're thinking of? So when we talk about these issues, they do have big international implications. And the other thing that is an international issue is precisely this white identity politics that you were saying. We don't talk about that as identity politics, but in Europe, white identity politics is a driving force in a lot of the right-wing politics that is also on the rise across that continent. So there are a lot of things that we talk about domestically that are deeply international and where the second administration will have an impact. We don't know what. So I think in turning to foreign policy, one thing that we saw in Donald Trump's first term is the way in which unpredictability is a method with him, that chaos is part of his method. I heard the other day a discussion about tariffs. And we were just talking about this, is the first sort of throwdown, is that really what he wants to achieve, or does he view that as part of his art of the deal? Like, well, I'm going to say we're going to have this level of tariffs with Mexico and Canada, but maybe he doesn't really mean that. And so part of the problem is looking at that unpredictability, the way he is driven by highly personal motivations and decision-making, including narcissism and desire to make money, including off of international deals, that have an impact that are different than from simply an ideological approach. We've seen this in some of his pronouncements on tariffs, on NATO, on what Israel might do with Gaza, as well as personnel announcements that are designed to shock, and that we don't know. For example, really, will he continue to support his Secretary of Defense nominee, or will he back down and then his replacement looks reasonable, as with, say, Attorney General? There is the family business. This is something that we just never have seen before. The way in which his family orbit makes money off of international relations and engages in deals that have international impacts. There's things that we don't know. We, the general public, don't fully understand the depth of his relationship, for example, with Vladimir Putin. And all of this comes at a time when there really is a need for deep rethinking of our foreign policy and our foreign policy structures. That's been talked about for a long time. But train wrecking it is not the kind of reform that we need. And then finally, I'm going to touch a little more and go back to each one of these. There's the indirect or the soft power implications. So for that white identity movement in Europe, the election of Donald Trump is great. So that's a positive. For others, the chaos that he brings is worrisome and may lead other countries to make decisions that may not be good for the United States. I think that all of this makes you see why it's hard to put a label. Sometimes we hear on the news people use the label isolationist for example, to describe Trump's foreign policy approach. And that doesn't really capture it. He does come out of this deeply conservative tradition, but not in a very traditional way. There's some discussion of perhaps this what may be called a Jacksonian, or, he uses the term America first, not in an isolationist way, but in a we'll do whatever we want as I, Donald Trump, decide. We've seen that before, and there is a little bit of a way in which that, like as Larry said, the president has for a long time, especially in foreign policy and national affairs, kind of been able to do what he wants as long as he has the budget to do it. Congress does not effectively stop the president, but I think we are bound to see this on a scale that we had not seen before. But it's not always ideological. If you think back to the first term, he railed against NAFTA, for example, and then in the end negotiated a follow-on treaty that really wasn't that different from NAFTA. It wasn't a breaking of the norms of the free trade between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. An area that gives us an insight into this sort of crazy quilt approach is in appointments. So some of them have clearly been designed to shock, like the Secretary of Defense nominee, a right-wing nationalist who is credibly accused of sexual assault and drunkenness on the job, Tulsi Gabbard to be the Director of National Intelligence, when many have expressed deep concern about her ties to Russia. And the presence of Elon Musk, not just on a phone call, but in Paris with Trump this past weekend for the Notre Dame rededication. And so, but then on the other hand, you have Marco Rubio nominated as Secretary of State and Michael Waltz as National Security Advisor, who are deeply conservative, but very mainstream in terms of their backgrounds and things they've been involved in. And then, while the United States has always stood alone in the deeply, deeply corrupt practice of selling ambassadorships, we have started to see now naming of people in this family business orbit that we just, haven't seen before. His, Ivana's father-in-law, who's a convicted criminal, to be ambassador to Paris. Imagine the French government saying, okay, now what are we going to do with this? If they say no, then that creates problems with Trump. If they say yes, then they've got this whole entourage that comes in as part of that. And that, I would say that family side, to me, keeps throwing a spin on things that we haven't thought of before. In the first administration, the need for reform in the State Department was instead met with, practices that drove a lot of really talented people at all levels out the door. This is not how you achieve reform. This is how you get rid of people. Vice President-elect J.D. Vance held up dozens of ambassadorial nominees based on a search for people with woke backgrounds in the Foreign Service. That if you wanted to be an ambassador and you had a program at your post, I had a friend that had this happen, program at your post focused on LGBTQ issues, then he, as senator, would hold that up. What influence will we see of that perspective as a policy, and how will that drive away the good people that we need? And so I'll just touch on a couple of more points. I think we also will see a similar problem, potentially, but we don't know, at the multilateral level. Donald Trump hates multilateral institutions of all types. He pulled us out of the Paris Agreement, the Iran Accord, but he always had an ambassador to the UN. It's really hard. He didn't stop the accession of a couple of new members into NATO during his first term. He didn't really do anything to deeply change how NATO operated, but the rhetoric created a lot of thinking in Europe about, well, we need to plan for a future where we can't depend on the US. Will he go further in his second term? And if so, will he simply destroy those institutions at a time when those, like US institutions, really need a lot of deep rethinking and not simply destruction? And And so I just would finish up, and there's so many other things I'm happy to take questions about anything really. Like I said, I think the impact that is very hard to predict is this sort of soft power or sort of ripple effect. And that will come not just from foreign policy, but what happens domestically. If, in fact, we see families locked up, families of undocumented people locked up, if we see a real rollback of all kinds of civil protections that we that we boast about to the world, that will have an impact on the image of the U.S. in the world, and that then has a knock-on impact to a whole array of areas of foreign policy. So, as some people say, I take Donald Trump seriously and literally, and I think there's a lot to be concerned about, both in terms of our institutions and then how we operate in the world.
Thank you very much, Mary. I'm gonna use my prerogative as moderator to ask each of our panelists a question. Then we're gonna be turning to your questions that you've generated, and there are a number of them here, and they're fantastic. So keep them coming in. Larry, I want to start with you. You've written extensively about healthcare issues in the political sphere. There are estimates that around 50 million Americans rely on the Affordable Care Act for coverage, and there's been a long time attempt by Republicans in Congress, including Trump when in his first administration, to do something that would repeal potentially this act. Do you think that he's going to go for it again, and will he succeed?
He was asked this question in his debate with Kamala Harris, and he said, apparently earnestly, that he saved the Affordable Care Act, which gives a whole new meaning to save, because, of course, he devoted the first year in office to trying to kill it, and then used all sorts of regulatory policies and executive orders to try to weaken it to the point. I don't think he's going to invest the capital in trying to kill it. He's got a lot of people around him who thought that was a wasted effort. Plus, his allies in Congress don't want to do that again, including Mike Johnson, who's likely the Speaker in the House. But there's a whole lot that they will work on. In Congress, when the effort to pass a tax reduction bill goes through, they're going to be looking for so-called savings. And one of the areas that's going to be debated is cutting the Affordable Care Act's Medicaid expansion, which is incredibly important. It's had a tremendous impact, and an impact that's not really fully appreciated in reducing economic and racial disparities. It's one of the greatest impacts of social policy in our country's history. So they'll be going after that. We had history on the Medicaid efforts in 2017. The House passed really an effort to wipe out a lot of Medicaid, but the Senate responded and said, no, we're not going to let you do that. So we'll see what they can do, but I think Medicaid is going to be on the table. Under the Democrats and then their bipartisan legislation, the subsidies to purchase private health insurance on the ACA's so-called marketplace, these are private insurance policies, allowed coverage to increase dramatically, showing that really the issue here is access and affordability. And I think that'll be another area that the Republicans will go after and try to reduce. Again, remember that the division in the House is going to be 2 votes. And I think, and Republicans acknowledge this in the House when they're being honest, that they're going to need a deal with the Democrats. I think this will be, my hunch would be it's going to be part of the deal. But that's another way in which they could, it'll be a battle. Probably the biggest impact in real time is going to be the administrative regulations, because that is something Donald Trump controls. And I think what we're going to see is a weakening of regulations. Currently, regulations, this is probably more robust than you were looking for, of regulations around what are considered essential benefits have gone back and forth, and the Trump administration created something called skinny plans, which were really very limited benefits. The Biden administration, before that the Obama administration, created a regulatory structure in which insurers had to provide coverage for things like women's reproductive health. I'm not talking about abortion. I'm talking about pap smears and regular checkups and a whole host of other things. And I think we'll see Trump weakening those. So I don't think they're going to try to wipe it out entirely. That seems to be a fool's errand. Mm-hmm. But I think there are a lot of ways in which they're going to ram the doors. Maybe it gets defeated in Congress, but I think the bigger impact is going to be in regulation. Mm-hmm. Big thing to notice on all these regulatory moves and the use of executive orders, they're temporary. Mm-hmm. And all the things you could think about that Donald Trump did in his first term, like the ban on Muslims and other things, they were reversed as soon as Joe Biden came in. On his first day, he just threw that out. So that's something else to keep in mind. Are these permanent, ongoing changes, or is it kind of a temporary sop to the base and the mobilized people?
Thank you. Michael, I want to turn to some of your comments. You started your comments by talking about how some of these appointments or proposed appointments are people no longer operating in the shadows, right? And Mary, you've talked about some of the more mainstream suggestions that Trump has suggested. But I think we're all aware that many of the proposed appointments for cabinet positions, et cetera, don't have a lot of experience working in the area of policy. So the question is this, Michael, does this weaken, if he's successful appointing these folks, does it weaken his administration to have people who don't have that deep experience working in the federal government bureaucracy?
Well, it depends, right? The one thing that the former president or president-elect has said that he wants to weaken the civil service system. And if that's possible, yeah, then it really will matter, right? Like the political appointees, because a lot of times these political appointees, they provide direction, but you still have the civil service, the career professionals that have that institutional knowledge there, that are helping guide or provide information to the political appointees who are helping set the vision of these agencies. If you can get rid of those, or at least get those individuals saying, I'm going to leave government, right? Like just even the threat. And they said, I'm going to leave, I don't want to work here anymore. That could be a devastating blow. And then what you said, then yes, then it rely more on the political appointees that may be there for 4 years, 2 years. It really weakens that knowledge that you need in order to run one of these, like the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice. Those are. They deal with serious issues, criminal investigations. If you don't have that type of knowledge, if you don't have those career civil servants there, it's just going to be very difficult to do. So yes, if there's a big blow, or even if the threat and you start having people move, I've heard the anecdotes, right, that some people are already resigning, they're leaving their post, and that could have a very chilling effect. And the FBI, there are concerns. I heard Christopher Wray, he's going to resign now, and Trump's bringing in his appointee. And also the ideological position, right? So usually these appointees, they come in, and they have this view of the world, right? And then they're like, okay, no, this is how it really works, right? And so that's the concern I'm having, that some of these appointments are so far to the right, they may not want to listen to the career professionals that are still there. So Mary probably has more.
I'm sure Mary does have, as a career in the State Department, has an opinion about that, but I want to ask you a different question,
Okay.
Mary.
Can I just say I sent in my passport application very early yesterday because I'm afraid that by next summer, the career civil servants at the passport agency who know how to issue passports may not be there anymore. So it's real. I think that people are worried about that, yeah.
Good note to self on the passport. Yeah, Larry just wrote it down too. I'm interested in your perspective. All of us, I think, are trying to get our hands around the evolving situation in Syria.
Oh, yeah.
And that's an example of an escalation and a very significant change in the conflict in the Middle East. The larger question I have for you is that you've described Trump not as an isolationist necessarily. He has shadows of that. Is he a Jacksonian? Is he America first? The larger question I have is, what is his presidency going to mean for any of the number of global conflicts that are underway now, and America's presence or lack of presence in trying to facilitate solutions to those conflicts?
I think that's a very difficult question, and I think with regard to the conflict in the Middle East, to me is even harder because what, in my opinion, this administration, allowed to happen without using any significant pressure on Israel at all to stop what they were doing in Gaza, it has already cast a shadow on U.S. influence in not just in that region, but in other parts of the world where the expectation always was that, well, at least the U.S. could try to influence Israel. I think that is, I think that in areas of conflict, and there's conflicts not just in Ukraine and in Gaza, and well now, Lebanon, is Syria, but there's also significant conflict going on, for example, in Sudan. And the reform that I talked about that's so desperately needed within UN institutions and within U.S., I think, foreign policy institutions, what I worry about is the unpredictability of it all has the potential to lessen the U.S. ability to convince the multinational institutions to do the things that at least some of the times we can, because the U.S. supports, for example, peacekeeping missions at a scale higher than any other country, about 25%. And interestingly, that did not drop significantly during the first Trump administration. He railed about it, but then nothing actually changed in the budget levels. And if you don't have people who want to or can engage in negotiations, then, at least we saw, for example, a ceasefire deal with Lebanon and Israel that's been kind of shaky, but at least it happened, and the United States and France and some others played an important role because the United States was trusted, despite everything, to engage those conversations, use some of the leverage that it had. And what we've seen, what I think will happen if you drive really good people out of the State Department or the National Security Council, the staff there, who will be the people who can sit down and really have those conversations? And we don't know that. But the weird thing about Trump that you can't predict is that I think there were a lot of people who thought maybe it's not a bad idea to sit down with the leader of North Korea. Maybe that's long overdue. But then the problem was that then he didn't take it anywhere. He stepped out of the discussion in Vietnam when he met with Kim Jong-un. And so there were a lot of people who actually said, it's actually overdue for the United States to at least try to talk to North Korea. But then it was all a show. And so I think that that lack of seriousness then can have a really negative impact on our ability to engage in any of these conflicts or in the multilateral institutions that are trying to solve that.
Thank you for those thoughts. I'm going to turn to the questions that you've generated now. You may not hear your exact question. I'm going to try to get to as many as possible, so I'm going to start collapsing some of these into, because there are some themes that are emerging. So one of the themes that's emerging is around tariffs. Right? Mary, you remarked on the prospect of tariffs. And so this is a two-part question. Larry, I'd like for you to weigh in on the imperial presidency and to what extent Congress may be in a position to try to wrest some of this authority back. There's a question that asserts that the presidency has gradually taken more and more control over issues related to trade and tariffs. Do you think it's likely that this Congress or the next will be in a position to kind of retrench on some of these things? Do they have an interest in that? Mary, I'd like your thoughts on it. If these do go through, what's the retaliation going to look like? And how does that shape some of our foreign policy?
Let's all put our heads together and think the last time Congress did something big and important within a year's time, 3 years' time, 4 years' time. I just think the institutional divisions and corrosion of the processes in Congress make it very difficult to entertain the possibility that Congress is going to do something for itself, for its own institutions. And so if you look at on a whole host of issues, the thrust of it has been presidential initiative and assertion of powers, Congress, protesting, or a few members protesting, a few hearings, and nothing happens. One of the most egregious cases of this is Congress's power in the area of war making is clear. It's very specific, and it involves the power of the purse. So you would say, oh yeah, here's somewhere where Congress really has the power and could do something. And yet, well more than 200 times, President has taken us into active or imminent military conflicts on their own. If you go back just after 9/11, Congress passed almost unanimously something known as the Authorization for Use of Military Force. And it was meant to provide authorization for actions in Afghanistan and perhaps, in that neighborhood. It's still around. Joe Biden just recently used it to justify sending military support into the Middle East to help defend Israel. So think of that. Here's something that was created after 9/11 and it's being used for something entirely different. And, this is what, you go back to George H.W. Bush. He used this to justify unilateral domestic spying. So my point here is, in Congress, there were members who were very concerned, held hearings, earnestly talked about repealing this AUMF. Never even got really a vote on it. It's faded. There are areas with regards to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act where there was conversations about rolling back some of the more egregious areas of unilateral executive action, of spying on us without a warrant, and didn't really go anywhere. So, no, I have no faith that Congress is going to kind of stand up for itself. There's some people who are saying President can draw, authority from some of the statutory language that does exist, along with their own executive powers, which I've been referencing. That may happen. Congress probably won't act. It'll go to the court system, and it's quite possible the courts will find a technical ground not to consider it, or they may simply more or less pass on it and kind of tolerate what the president is doing.
Thank you. Mary, how about you? Is there a trade war brewing?
I think that there could be, although I was at an interesting presentation the other day that reminded me that this is another one of those trends that's not just in the U.S., there has been a global growth in, and there's an economic term for it that I don't know, but of countries raising tariffs to, have fees for access to their economy. And so the United States isn't alone. And so in a way that is already out there. But the sort of bombastic and unilateral pronouncements are on a scale that's different. And also, Biden did not lower a lot of the tariffs on China, for example. But it's not just, it's often mentioned in terms of China, but the first tweet or whatever that Trump put out about it was about Mexico and Canada. The EU is very worried about it, and they will retaliate. They are not shy about that. They have their auto industry, which Trump tried to put tariffs on previously, and so there is a lot of concern about that. But also, I would just like to add to what Larry said about the War Powers Act. Also, and I checked it really quickly, also in Article 1, it says that Congress shall regulate trade, right? Mm-hmm. And in 1934, Congress basically said, oops, we can't do that anymore, we screwed up, And so the laws that were passed in the 1930s ceded the constitutional power to negotiate trade deals. So they already, even before they gave the War Powers Act up, right, they gave up the power to regulate trade. Right. And so I don't see, I agree with Larry, if I do see retaliations, now some of those retaliations may lead to negotiation of trade deals, as happened with the NAFTA UMCA deal. But, sometimes the EU, for example, just says, they're also good fighters, right? They know how to fight a trade fight. That's their bread and butter, right? Mm-hmm. And so it could hurt the U.S. economy. It could hurt trade. They might go to Canada for other things. So I think absolutely there will be retaliation. Yeah.
But, Ryan, let me add one
Please
thing.
do.
So the presidency, the office of the presidency has grown and has a lot of power, but Congress, they do these things for reasons, right? They want to have the executive branch to have the ability to negotiate favorable trade deals. Also, they don't want, Congress still has when presidents negotiate treaties, it still has to go before Congress has to get approved, but they realize it's very difficult to even get treaties done, right? And then also, members of Congress, they don't want to take the heat on some of these deals, right? Because it upsets some of their constituents. So, hey, I didn't do it, president did it, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a way they can defer some of that authority. They don't have to take, like with NAFTA, Clinton did it, Mm-hmm. we didn't do it. We don't know why we did it. And mm-hmm. so Congress, they can delegate, right? Now, the question is, do they have the will and the power to bring it back? They could, but I don't think that they want that responsibility. They'll let the office of the presidency do that.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to come back to you now. There's a set of questions about immigration enforcement, and I wonder if you could comment on logistically, what does this look like? Is this about Trump signaling or referring to the Insurrection Act and the Alien Sedition Act and sending out military forces? Could this potentially involve a military incursion into Mexico? There's even a question about that. What is your sense about how this was going to, if we take him seriously, how is this going to be implemented? What is his attempt going to look like?
I do think that, like I said, you have to believe him, right? If he's going to issue an executive order in terms of some of these protected places like places of worship, hospitals, jobs, I definitely can see how you can have the news media there and you can show to the base that you mean business. Now, to the extent that he can mobilize the U.S. military, right, to go down to the border, I think that's going to be, look, the president has the authority to do that, right, as commander-in-chief. The there could be a lot of legal implications, right? Like, what if they end up rounding up American citizens, right? Like, how do they know? Incursion into Mexico, I mean, I can't see that happening. I guess that's possible. I doubt if that would happen. But I do see him could possibly mobilize the military just to show force, to show that we mean business. Now, will they actually engage in, and there are a lot of legal, I mean, like, there is federalism still, right? Like, you can't just, the president has to work with the states on this. And I imagine there'll be many governors that might be willing to participate with the Office of the Presidency to engage in some of these things. I hope federal resources aren't expended that way, but it's very possible.
Larry, you're looking at me like you want to get in.
Well, yeah, I agree with what Michael just said, and I would also add, and I say this to everyone here, there's a risk to overinflating Donald Trump's power. I don't think he's like this all-powerful being. I think he's immortal. And I think if you look back at his first term, in a lot of ways it was a failure. His legislative productivity outside of the tax cut was pretty limited. He was able to pass some significant legislation at the tail end of his administration, mostly because he gave up and cut these huge deals with Democrats. The Supreme Court was repeatedly shooting him down. Now, the reason that I would counsel against overinflating him is it leads to a sense of fatalism, a sense of hopelessness and disengagement. Why protest? Why do the analysis that you all are trained to do when he's going to win? No, he's not going to necessarily win. It's not in the bag. I think there's going to be, in the coming months and years, a very raucous battle and conflict and debate. And you all should be part of it. If you disagree with them. If you agree with them, then I think you need to, probably sign on for the other side of this, because this should be, a very important moment in our country's history.
Thank you. You are part of an initiative out of the Humphrey School on election administration. There was a lot of discussion leading up to this election about fraud, the potential for inappropriate things to happen in the election. That rhetoric certainly trailed off. There's a question here, however, about what effect this administration and perhaps this Congress could have on retrenchment and voting rights going forward. And I know that you have an interest in this, but I suspect that many panelists might have thoughts on this.
Yes, so we have started about 15 years ago, the Certificate in Election Administration. There are about 140 student enrollments. It's the largest training program in the country. We've been holding all sorts of programs. We feel pretty good about how things went in 2024, and I think for good reason. Now, there are a lot of things to be worried about. One of them is, will there be an effort to roll back voting rights? There could well be. I think it's probably going to move forward in states. We've seen that in some states. It doesn't come in the form of you can't vote. It comes in the form of voting booths are going to close early. Or, you can't have water brought to you if you're standing in line for 2 hours in Georgia. I mean, it's stuff really meant to irritate and to disengage people. So I'm not envisioning a kind of fulsome attack on voting rights. I don't think there would be votes in Congress. This would be something where there would be opposition. In the House, I don't know if you could get a majority for that, given the defections of some of the more, there are a few moderate Republicans. That's all you would need. And the Senate, it would be filibustered. And I think even this Supreme Court would be hesitant if there was a kind of full-scale rolling back. Again, the theme here is this is not a whole new world we're entering into, which politics and conflict and an institution that's going to disappear, and it's going to be kind of Peter Pan Donald Trump's way.
So Ryan, I want to maybe expand this question a little bit. So yeah, not necessarily in terms of statutes and whether they're going to be more restrictive statutes. I mean, that's probably going to continue in the various states. I mean, the Department of Justice has very little power because the various sections in the Voting Rights Act have been weakened where the Department of Justice can't review these changes to state voting laws. But I do think related to this question of immigration enforcement, I think it, if just imagine during the midterms, the military just happens to be in the area. And you're trying to say, oh, let's come out and vote. Yeah, if one parent is a citizen, one is undocumented, are you going to really take that chance to show up and vote? Those are the type of effects that could happen where you could discourage or demobilize people from participating in democracy. I do think it is interesting in terms of like the counting of people. So like, Texas is probably one of the states, one of the biggest beneficiaries of undocumented immigrants, right? Well, when you're counting people for the census, they don't go, they just, you're overestimate whatever, and you get a bunch of resources based on your population. Matter of fact, Texas has gained seats in the U.S. House of Representatives because of its exploding population, right? Mm-hmm. But yet I think it's funny where they say, well, we need to crack down on that. And even Democrats have gotten really bad with Republicans because, they got those additional seats. And of course, Republicans, they control the state legislature. They're going to draw majority Republican districts. And Democrats are like, wait a minute, the only reason we even have these districts is because of more Latinos in the state. So I just think it's fascinating how these politics play out, right? Where states have benefited in terms of representation. I mean, it's no different from when blacks were enslaved, and southern states said, hey, we want to count them as 3/5. That was the compromise, right? 3/5 citizens in order for representation. But yeah, we don't want them to be a citizen. So it's some of this debate playing out now in the 21st century.
Thank you, Michael. We're going to do a couple more questions, and then we're going to call it an evening. It's a cold night, and I'm sure that people want to get home safely. Mary, I wonder if you can respond to this question. There's some of the U.S. allies have been very consistent for decades. In other cases, there's been things are in flux. How do you see this current administration and our network of allies shifting, if at all?
You mean the incoming administration?
Sorry, incoming.
Yeah. So I think whenever you think about that question, you have to remember that the other side also has their own motivations, and that they have their own domestic political situations, and that will impact how they react to Donald Trump. So, for example, a great example of this is with regard to the question of NATO. France has never loved NATO, their members, and at every opportunity, not just Macron, but French presidents before him have been pushing the EU for a long time to create their own more robust security structure that France and especially would like to see as a challenger, sort of, to NATO, and something that the United States is not involved in. Normally, you could look at this and say, okay, this is going to be a great opportunity for France to really now push that idea as they sort of did before. But Macron made a huge political mistake last summer, called elections. He's in a weak position, so he is in no position himself to do that. And so you saw him welcoming Donald Trump and Elon Musk to the Notre Dame Cathedral. he will not say no to Jared Kushner's father being ambassador. And so there's always two sides of that question. There are a number of countries that if, for example, Tulsi Gabbard is confirmed as Director of National Intelligence, how will our intelligence allies, not just the closest ones, but others respond to having somebody that a lot of people think is probably too close to Russia for their comfort? How will countries, and then on the other hand, will a country like India, will somebody like Modi say, okay, Donald Trump and I can understand each other, and could that have a positive impact? And so I think it will make some of our closest allies very wary, but they will also have their own interests that they're going to be pursuing that will mean that it won't be a clear sort of yes or no answer. And I actually think, for example, that could include Israel, right? I mean, he's nominated Mike Huckabee as ambassador there, but Huckabee comes from that very particular Christian evangelical perspective that views Israel as sort of the necessary predecessor to the second coming. And that's a weird kind of relationship that would make a lot of Israelis a little hesitant because it requires not just the creation of Israel, but the destruction of Israel too. So, the person he said is going to be his Middle East advisor, which is Tiffany's father-in-law, is from a small Lebanese Christian sect who's associated with Hezbollah, right? And so there's never a simple, that's one of the things I think with Trump is it's never simple, right? And so I think each country will be looking at the situation and calculating it based on what they see actually happen, and then also, of course, what they think they can, that's what foreign policy is, right? It's advancing what your country needs and wants, as interpreted by the current government. And then those governments have their own domestic politics. So I think it's pretty difficult to say. I'm sure even Vladimir Putin isn't confident that he can, I don't think, despite all the memes and everything else, I do not think Donald Trump gets up in the morning and calls Vladimir Putin and says, hey, what should I do today? I think there is clearly some kind of a relationship there, but I think that it's pretty hard to predict. And that in almost every case you have to look at what's going on in that country as well and what do they want to get out of any of these things.
Thank you. Final question before we go into that cold night. This is not going to be directed to any particular panelist. I'm curious who wants to take this one up. Should we interpret the incoming Trump administration and his victory in this last election as a data point in a larger trend in populism globally? That is, are we seeing a fundamental shift in how we ought to think about democracy in elections?
I would say, the U.S. is part of a global pattern. We've seen, throughout Europe, with some exceptions, rising globalization, backlash against economic inequality, immigration, all these things are kind of flowing together. I would say in the United States, one of our challenges is that our institutions are remarkably ill-prepared for this. If you look in, let's say, the United Kingdom, which just had an election this summer, they excluded, a series of right-wing and also left-wing candidates who were offering their own brands of populism. And why did they do that? Well, they thought they weren't going to attract median voters. They were also found their policies to be outside what they were wanted. We don't have that ability in the U.S. The nomination process is entirely decided in primaries. The turnout in the primaries is very small, relative. to the size of the electorate. And in general, those who are voting in the primaries tend to be extremists, particularly in the Republican Party. So the point here is, yes, the populism is something we can see, certainly, in democratic nations. I think one of the differences in the U.S., we don't have, the procedures in place or no longer in place to try to check that.
Thank you. Michael, Mary, you content to have, for Larry to have the last word, or do you want to get in on this?
I'll say just a quick thing. I think, yes, there is a trend, and it's not like a uniform, monolithic trend, but there is a trend toward, some of these right-wing parties. And one thing that I think I only mentioned even once, one thing that we've hardly touched on is the whole issue of the knock-on effects of the climate crisis. And one of those is massive migration. And that absolutely also is a factor in the rise of right-wing parties across Europe. And that, to me, just is an issue, the link between those two issues and the impact that that's going to continue to have on politics is here in the U.S. and in many parts of the world is really something that we need to think about, not just with this administration, but more generally.
And I just wanted to add, I take a more optimistic view of our country. Yeah, so it's populism going, but it's not the first time it's happened in the United States, much less the world. But I do think it's growing pains for our country, right? It is a transition into a multiracial democracy, and where you're seeing groups that were previously excluded maybe ascending to some of the highest positions within our political system. Now, so the natural pushback is to say it's not legitimate. It's not fair to try to delegitimize these institutions, but it's part of the process. It's happening. We look at the census data. It's happening, and there's no denying of it. And so these groups can try as they may, and they will rise and they'll win, but eventually it will change. And so I just think that we should be patient with this transition, and I think that the United States will continue to be a leader to the rest of the world of how. Again, we're not perfect, right? But how we make that transition to a multiracial democracy.
Excellent. That's such a great way to close
you.
things out. Thank you.
Before we thank our panelists, let me thank you for coming out on what I know is a very a busy time of the semester as you conclude. Thanks for being here and being a part of this discussion with us. And with that, let's give our panelists a nice round of applause. Thank you, everybody. Get home safely, everybody. Thank you for coming out.